says that we're not going to mic you up, we're going to give you bites.
Test.
So, a quick welcome. I'm not going to stand on the stage with you, but Christiana, Tom, thank you both for taking some time. So maybe what we'll do is ask you to introduce yourselves to our audience. As I've explained, we are quite geographically diverse. In terms of our industries, we're very diverse, and we all share the same planet and its challenges, and want to hear from you how we can engage with some of those global agendas. So without further ado, please.
Fantastic. Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. We're delighted to be here in Davos talking to you. So my name is Tom Rivett-Carnac. I'm a political strategist. I ran political...
It used to be Tom Carnac. Now that he's a published author, he's Tom Rivett-Carnac.
So I didn't get married. I just came out of the closet as being double-barreled. Exactly. I was already married. So I'm a political strategist. I've done that for many years, and I joined Christiana at the UN 3 years before Paris. We actually went for a walk. We met in New York and went for a walk and talked about what was necessary and what was going to be required over the course of the next 24 months to get the Paris Agreement. At the end of which she said to me, well, it's clear to me you have none of the skills and experience necessary for this job, but I think you'd be great, so let's do it. So that's how we began our partnership, and we've worked together ever since. Do you want to introduce yourself? Do you know who Christiana is?
She wants you to do it.
I'm not sure that I could do such a fun story as that one, Tom. Well, let me just say that I'm certainly delighted to be continuing to work with Tom. We've been working together for what seems like a lifetime, but is only a few years. And perhaps the most trying moment that we both shared was the final lead up to the Paris Agreement, and where we worked hand in hand. I was managing more the government side of things, and Tom was corralling the non-government side of things and making sure that the governments would get the confidence to finally adopt a very ambitious Paris Agreement. But what we have discovered about each other is that we have very different skill sets and very different ways of expressing each other, but that we share the same values and principles, and that we share the most important, which is we devote our life not to climate change. We devote our life to the quality of life that our children are going to have. That is our motivating force.
So actually, our story is quite a good way for us to get into this. And Christiana and I have just written a book, and we're partly going to touch today on some of the ideas that came out in that book. It's due out on the 25th of February. It's called The Future We Choose, available now for pre-ordering. And when we came together in 2015, the world was facing this moment of profound consequence in the Paris Agreement. There had been years of attempts to really draw countries together in common purpose. And it had been very difficult to do so, and Christiana can talk for a long time about why, and you'll know some of those reasons, and we'll get into them. And we worked together to bring all stakeholders together to really realize that moment of global togetherness that was the Paris Agreement. That was a remarkable moment. But what's interesting is we've left this issue so late that already we are now facing another moment of profound consequence that is potentially even more consequential and impactful than 2015, and that's this year in 2020. So I know many of you know this, but just to set up where we are at the moment in the world, we know that to have any chance of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees, beyond which the impacts become exponential in terms of these really quite alarming natural feedback loops that get triggered, we have to reduce our emissions by half over the next 10 years. Aggregated up, that's somewhere between 7 and 8% a year. If we don't do that, then we are the generation that failed when it mattered. And we are the generation that got to this point, knew what we were facing, and didn't prioritize it. Now that's kind of a lot, right, for us to live with and for us to internalize, particularly when it's not clear what we do as a result of that. And our actions and the relationship between our actions and the outcomes can seem very diffuse, particularly when we're running businesses, we're running companies. I say something like that, and then after this, you'll all walk out and Davos will continue. But actually, everything has to be different from here. This is an emergency, and we have to start treating it like it's an emergency. Christiana, how are you feeling about how 2020 is going?
Well, the other thing that I wanted to add to that, just to bring it down, you know, close and personal, is all of the YPO members are what average between 40 and 50 or something like that. So your children or the children of your siblings, or, you know, you will have a beloved child in your life. And that beloved child is X, whatever. Let's say it's anywhere between 0 and 15 or 16. That child will be more or less your age in 2050, more or less. Now, what is daunting about that is that you are now at the fullness of your life, and you know the quality of life that you have enjoyed and that we delude ourselves currently about enjoying, unless we are attentive to what is going on around the world, such as in Australia. But that delusion will no longer be available to that child unless we do what Tom has said, which is half emissions by 2030, and that's not for that child to do. Let us very quickly get out of the irresponsibility of saying, thank God the youth are on the streets, they're going to save us. That is irresponsible. It's us who have to do it. Those of us who are adults right now have the responsibility to actually bend the curve, and put us back on the right track. It is not for the children to do, but they will suffer the consequences. So can you imagine that that beloved child will be your age in the fullness of her or his life, and she will either live in a world that is under constant destruction, constant conflict, constant brink of wars about water, about food, about land. There will be mass migrations such as we have never seen if we continue to do what we have been doing, just if we continue the decade like this. Conversely, that child will live in a much better world, right? A much better world. A world that has been actually re-greened, and the child will live on a green planet again. There will be managed water. There will be trees everywhere. The air will be breathable, as opposed to, you know, under world number 1, where the air wasn't even breathable. They will be breathable. We will have completely transformed the way that what we eat, how we grow the food, how we transport ourselves, how we build cities, how we design cities. We will what deserves our financing. We will completely have transformed the economic structure that we're now living in. But to do that, we only have 10 years. That total transformation, we only have 10 years, because by 2030, should we continue what we're doing right now, we will have loaded the atmosphere enough to make any positive transformation completely impossible. So that's a daunting moment that we're facing, right? And it's the first time in human history that, as I care to say, that we're holding the pen on the future. We are writing right now what the future is going to look like. And it's the only 10 years in the history of humankind, in fact, in the entire lifetime of us humans, that we can. Because after 2030, we no longer hold the pen. Our influence on nature will have been so diminished, and nature will be at such an escalating transformation scale that we no longer have any influence on that. We will not be able to control it. So folks, 10 years, quite a daunting thought, but one that we understand because of science. Science has told us very clearly, yes, a world of disaster is entirely possible, entirely possible. So, you know, it's true, all the horrible things that we hear. Otherwise, ask Australia if you don't believe that they're true. It is entirely possible, but it is not inevitable. And that's what we really want you to remember. It is not inevitable. All of those terrible stories, all of those projections of science are possible. We're not negating them. We actually are very committed to changing that. What we have to remember is that we can change that, and that we have the possibility right now, if we start right now, because we only have a very short 10 years, and in the history of humanity, 10 years is a blink, then we can create a very, very different world for our kids. So quite an important moment.
Indeed, and how we approach that as human beings is part of what we explore in our book. And that's a little bit of what we'd like to talk about today, as well as some of the practical things we need to do. But just to contextualize that a little bit, when I joined the UN, I read an article that had been written about Christiana and the UN and the process of the Paris Agreement by Elizabeth Colbert in the New Yorker. And it described Christiana's job as having the greatest differential of responsibility, saving the world from global collapse, to responsibility, practically none, which is sort of the situation, which is sort of the situation we're kind of all in at the moment, right? We are responsible, but we don't have power. We don't feel we have complete power to change that outcome. So that was a very interesting exercise in how do you change a system when you don't control it? And that's a situation we're all in all the time, right? We're all part of systems that we're trying to exert control over which we have very limited influence. And what we learned throughout that process is if you can't change the content, then what you do is you change how you engage. And you change who you are in that engagement. And you push for that type of change in others as well. Because the outcome of a system is the outcome of who is participating in that system. So on the road to Paris, the road to these negotiations had been absolutely moribund with distrust, with negativity, and a very deliberate part of our strategy was to shift that. And the first part was about optimism. Do you want to talk about optimism?
Sure.
Go for it. We're just learning how to do this, really.
So optimism. So what do we not mean by optimism? Okay, what we do not mean by optimism is any kind of La La Land, despite the movie, La La Land, naive thinking that, oh well, you know, we can just go along our merry way and everything will take care of itself. Far be it from that. We are totally, totally apprised of the challenges that are right in front of it. So we're not saying that things will be well. We're also not even saying that we're guaranteed success, because that would also be illusory to think that that by merely working together and doing everything that we think we can, that's going to guarantee success. We know that that's not the case. So optimism for us is not the result of having achieved anything yet. It's actually the input to a challenge. We believe that in order to stand any decent chance of addressing a challenging issue, which climate is, we have to be optimistic. Think of yourself, you know, if you were a runner and you want to run a marathon, but you say, well, actually, I'm not sure, I'm not really fit, my eating habits are not really good, it's probably gonna be too cold, my shoes are not good. Well, for sure you won't be able to run the marathon, right? So you have to go at it, particularly if there's a challenge ahead, you have to go at it with a gritty determination that you're gonna do everything that it takes in order to undertake that challenge. And that's the same attitude that we have to do with climate change. Falling into grief, despair, fear, all of which is totally understandable, and we share it. But it cannot be the end of our game. We have to be able to honor the fear, to honor the despair, to get in touch with it, but also move beyond it into gritty determination, into the conviction that we as humans are smart enough and we are developed enough as a species to actually be able to engage in this. That's what we mean by optimism. Last night we were at a nightcap, and a wonderful woman came up to me and said, you know, I listened to your podcast. Tom and I have a podcast called Outrage and Optimism. And she said to me, I listened to your podcast, and way back in one of the beginning podcasts, you asked for a word that would better describe what you mean by optimism. And she said, you know, I thought about it, and I looked at it, and I came up with your magical word. And I said, what is it? And she said, heliotropy. Now, I said, and what on earth is that? So heliotropy, or sometimes written P-Y and sometimes P-H-Y, is the science that explains why plants turn to the sun in order to grow. And that was a really interesting moment for me last night, because I thought that's exactly it, right? We turn toward that which gives us energy, that which motivates us, that which gives us whatever we need to grow into the challenge that we have. But we keep our roots in the ground. We don't go off into la la land, right? So think of a sunflower that turns, you know, toward the sun, or any plant that looks for the light in order to grow, but keeps its roots really into the ground, which is where the stubborn piece comes into, because we call ourselves stubborn optimists, because yes, we want to maintain that gritty determination. You can call it hope, you can call it whatever you want. But we cannot delude ourselves by thinking, well, we're not going to have, now that we know that we have taken this conviction, we're not going to have any challenges. Actually, we are going to have many challenges. We read about those challenges every day in the newspaper. That cannot stop us. We have to understand the challenges, understand the difficulties, and continue to move forward.
And I think part of that that's particularly interesting as we've thought about it and considered this concept of stubborn optimism that we've kind of developed through the book and elsewhere is, if you look back at history, the moments of great optimism have actually been when the outlook has been the darkest. If you think about moments of, you know, fight them on the beaches, Gandhi's salt marches, you know, civil rights movement, they've always been moments of darkness where success has not been assured. And what we would call a stubborn optimism has been like a candle in the darkness, like a flame in the darkness, to say we refuse to submit to that, and we know it's bad, and we know we're facing a difficult moment, but we're going to endure and we're going to push forward, and that's what changes the world. So use whatever word you want. You can use courage, you can use hope, but we have to embody that, because there are narratives now in climate around this is really big, and it can be really overwhelming, and we can put our heads back in the sand, and we lose the minute we do that. The next concept that we developed as we wrote this, we called, with intentional provocation, endless abundance. And the reason for that is that as we think about a future that is constrained by space in the atmosphere for emissions, that is becoming increasingly damaged by the impacts of climate change, one of the things that I think we're all afraid of is the idea of a reduction of abundance and of competition for those diminishing resources. Now, in Paris, what there was very interestingly, should I just tell that story about how we shifted the CBDR? Yeah? Okay. So for years in the climate negotiation, there had been this absolute fixation and obsession with this reductionist thinking. And it was called common but differentiated responsibility in UN speak.
Sorry to hit you with a
Exactly,
UN.
yeah. So what it means is everyone's responsible, but everyone's responsible in a different way. So this became a fight in the heart of the UN. And on the one side,
For decades.
developing countries would say, you caused this problem, and what's more, you said you'd sort it out in the early 90s. So go away and do something, and then come back and talk to us, and then we'll discuss doing something together. And that was right, intellectually. But the developed countries would say, well, the world has changed. The majority of the emissions now come from developing countries. We can't do this without you. This has to be an everyone, everywhere conversation. And that was also right? But they were both coming at it from a perspective of, how do we kind of get this thing off? How do we not get stuck with it? How do we sort of like get our big slice of the pie in a world of scarcity? And that kind of Gordian knot, you know, that concept, the more you pull it, the tighter it gets. That was sort of the experience for decades inside the negotiations. In the end, what Christiana was able to do throughout this process and many others was to flip it around and say, actually, this isn't about a shared risk. This is about your future and investing in your future, and it's about abundance. Because if you embrace this future, you can have a future with more green, you can have a future that is better for health, you can have a future that still has good economics that supports the well-being and the livelihood of people. And countries began to see the structure was flipped, right? So the countries, it wasn't you have to come with this, that, the other, is come with your best effort. And what we found was almost all countries were more ambitious than we possibly could have imagined through the old model. So this flipping from a model of scarcity to a model of abundance changed this very old discussion and made it, sort of remade it anew. Anything to add to that?
No, that's a good summary.
Okay.
And then I would take it to the third concept that we have distilled, which is radical regeneration. And regeneration has become sort of a very catchy word, and people are beginning to talk about the regenerative economy, regenerate the land, regenerate the oceans. So it's become a very catchy word. And we think it's new, but actually it's not. When you think about, again, any child, when you think of a good friend, when you think of a colleague that you really appreciate, we are regenerative at heart. When we see that someone is having a hard time, the first thing we do is we go to that person and we offer our help. And, for better or for worse, but we're there. We encourage them. We put a shoulder for them to cry on. We focus on the positive parts of it. And eventually, our intention is to bring that person back up to the game that they can play, or for a child, to reignite the self-confidence of that child. And we do that as humans because we're regenerative at heart. Now, the interesting thing is that the challenge of climate requires us to understand that we are regenerative at heart and that we are capable, and actually it's very it's a natural thing for us to do, but to extend the boundary of our regeneration, embrace, let me say, and do it also with nature, because that's not what we have done. Now, for years and years, we have been in an extractive economy that is extract, use, discard, through which we have killed 60% of all of the species on this planet, and we have cut 1/3 of all the trees that existed just 50 years ago. And so this radical regeneration, to turn our minds and say, this is not so different, right? We can do this. It is totally within our capability and our nature, in fact, to have a regenerative attitude toward ourselves, toward our loved ones, and toward nature. And there we are just totally thrilled to hear, for example, of the Trillion Trees initiative that is going to be announced tomorrow by Salesforce. We are delighted that there is so much going on in regenerating coral reefs. Coral reefs are one of the ecosystems that is most affected, and that if you think about it, your grandchildren will, unless we regenerate coral reefs, your grandchildren will never know what a coral reef is. So, they don't even have to worry about scuba diving because that's not going to be there for them. How is that? How is it possible that we would allow that? Whereas there are lots of experiments now farming corals, where they take little pieces of corals, they take them to the lab, they give them much better conditions under which they grow much faster, and they take them back into the ocean, and they actually regenerate themselves. And there are many, examples of rewilding, many examples of how we can regenerate both the land and the oceans. And we should not think about that as being impossible, or in fact even being difficult. We should think about that as a very natural extension of who we are as human beings and who we want to think ourselves to be.
So it's still a question, what do we do with all of that, right? Because that's kind of a way that we can approach this moment. And so we have a few different things, and and much of this is known, that we think we all need to take as human beings in all of our roles, whether we're running companies, big or small, in our families, in our communities. And it starts where we came from there. Is the first thing we have to do is realize that the future's going to be different. Whatever we do now, we are locked into quite a different world. And an instinct to nostalgia actually makes us vulnerable to certain political extremes, which are going to be one of the major risks in this transition, and we're already seeing that, right? The future doesn't have to be dark, but it is going to be different. And facing that, and also facing a certain degree of grief. A loss of biodiversity, an impact on humanity, etc., is going to make us feel sad. And it is. And I think part of the problem has been that we haven't allowed ourselves to really feel that in our bones. But we can't stay there. We have to use that as a galvanizing force to drive us to more action, to this gritty, determined optimism. Once we're able to do that, then we can begin, right? And this is the decade where we're going to find out whether we're serious. We all have to stop being consumers and start being stewards of this earth. And we know many of the actions that we need to take to make that right? We know that the continued use of fossil fuels is basically insupportable. And it is a rundown from here to getting to zero use. And it's hard and it's difficult. And it's not to say that there aren't challenges of integration and capacity and technology and all these other things, but the strides we're making there are enormous. And there is always more that we can do to push that forward in our own work. I mean, and the cost can be a challenge sometimes, but there are increasingly solutions to do that. We all have to take responsibility for doing that as quickly as we can in all parts of our lives. The trees thing is another one that we're really excited about. If you think about the world where we've done this, it will be a forest planet again. There was an amazing report that came out last year that you probably all saw that said that there is enough land on this planet that is not being used for human habitation, urban settlement, or wild land to replace half of all the trees that we've cut down since the dawn of agriculture. It's about 1 trillion trees or more. Now imagine a world where we had 1 trillion more trees. The boom of biodiversity, what it would feel to live like on that planet, right? That's a lot. That's a lot to work towards, and that's a very compelling future. There's nothing dark about that. That can be great. Capital flows need to be addressed, and that's somewhere where we're making an enormous amount of progress. The Asset Owners Alliance is a game changer. If you don't know about that, then you should have a look at it. This is Oliver Bäte at Allianz and a range of other asset owners that are now saying that their entire portfolios of trillions of dollars will be zero carbon by 2050, and they're writing that into mandates to asset owners. Now again, we can all play a role in that. We all have certain amounts of capital, we all choose to invest it in certain places, we generally have pensions, etc. We can participate in that in all sorts of ways, and it's incumbent upon us at this moment to find the ways that we can do that. Some of the other solutions and some of the other things we have to do are a bit less immediately evident. There's a very interesting project called Project Drawdown that some of you probably know, and they ranked all of the different solutions to climate change in terms of their total impact on greenhouse gas emissions. The top one was promote gender equality, because they discovered that actually, if you promote gender equality at all levels of the system, at a top level of the system in terms of leadership positions in corporations, countries, etc., completely universally, there are other metrics too around good governance, but climate is managed far better. Female legislators vote in support of climate legislation 3 times more than male legislators. So it's actually become a matter of survival that we're able to do what we have tried to do for a generation and actually achieve gender equality, because discrimination is still baked into the system, and we all know that. And the final thing I would say, and it relates to all of us, is we cannot stand by our political processes anymore, right? We have to become what our ancestors were, which is to really appreciate the privilege of living inside the political systems that most of us live inside. It's not enough just to feel disaffected, to vote every few years. We're seeing now the emergence of civil disobedience on the streets that is something new. And if you look back at all these very inspiring, the history of civil movements, as soon as they reach 3.5% of the population participating actively, there has never been a civil movement that has failed to achieve its aims once it's achieved 3.5% of a population, right? That can't be beyond us, 3.5%. We're getting there now with things like Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes, etc. Choose whatever works from a political point of view, but we all have to get much more involved in that.
So to conclude, I think there are a couple of things that we would like to leave with you. Number one, nothing of what we have said is the purview of huge companies. Nothing. Everything is the purview of us as individuals, whether we are the mother of a family, the father of a family, the CEO of a company. It doesn't matter how large or how small, whether we lead an institution, a financial institution, whether we're an employee. Nothing of that what we have said is actually beyond our capability to participate. It is very much a matter of, number one, internally making the shift that we need to in order to create the context, the internal context, to make the decisions out there, and then being very consequential about figuring out where the carbon is in your area of influence, whether that is a home, a community, a company, whatever. And then really cutting down on that such that we're at 1/2, you are at 1/2. And that means you as an individual, you as a family, you as a corporation, you and your community, every single level of the system counts. You don't have to be a huge company to make a difference. You can be a human and contribute to the 3.5% of the population that are going to make this difference. And so we would invite you to feel that that power that each of one has, and execute it, act on it, and make your difference felt. Because when we all meet again in 2030, which is where I would like to take you now, can you imagine how we will celebrate that we as human beings were able to stand up to the greatest challenge that has ever been, I wouldn't say dealt to us, because we actually created it ourselves. So we have stood up to the greatest challenge that we have ever been faced with, and we were successful. And we can be so proud to turn over a verdant, clean, healthy, non-polluted, regenerative, and regenerated world to the children of this world. So thank you very much, and please join us.
Thank you so much. If I may, well, we've answered that first part of the invitation because we're here, again, for the first time in our history, and we recognize as an organization, and there has been a shift, this YPO 3.0 is a new strategy to look outwardly focused for the first time, because we are a members organization, we look in, and we are aspiring to engage in this global conversation. So thank you both.
I hope it's more than the conversation.
Well,
conversation is not enough anymore.
You're quite right. And we want to be here in 2021.
I would like to hear you say we are engaging in the global action. Not in the global conversation. We're too late for that one.
Absolutely. And very much creating those very specific calls to action to our members. And thank you for putting it in such stark terms so that we can all understand the urgency that when we sit here in a year's time, which is our aspiration, to start saying that this kicked off a process where our members across the world stood up and together had a significant impact. Thank you both. Do we have time? I think we've only got a few minutes. Do we have a few minutes for questions?
Probably 5 minutes max.
Do you want to take questions? Do you want to? They do.
Perfect.
Okay. Do you mind? Just
No,
a
not
few
at all.
minutes, lovely. So.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm Lucy Armand from Nature for Climate Coalition. So this year is obviously a very important year for the climate negotiations and what happens at the end of the year at the COP. And what do you say? You're still having conversations with governments. What do you say to them when they're now looking at their nationally determined contributions and not stepping up to the amount that everyone wants them to do? How do you have those conversations with them, given your history in the last 5 years?
It's a pretty simple statement. It's look around you at the reality, right? Because governments tend, for many different reasons, they tend to have blinders on. And once they look around and they see what their private sector is doing, what their financial sector is doing, what the insurance industry is doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they get a very different picture of what is possible. So what do I say to governments is take off the blinders and look around you and then step up.
Hi, I'm Elyse Becker, and I'm Senior Advisor to the UN and Director of Climate and Sustainability. So I've been working on climate change for years, and I was in Australia because half of my family is there. And so it was such a shocking experience for my kids who are 9 and 6-year-old. Mm-hmm. And they told me, you know, my dream for next year is to go to another planet where we can be less people, with small villages, no cars, no pollution, where we can walk around, and where the temperature will not increase and there won't be any fires. So it's been really shocking for me, even if I've been working in this field, to see the reality of these dark ashes and the red bloody sun. You know, it did feel like the end of the world. So just going back to questions about what we can do. I mean, one is obviously behavior change. I don't want to get on an airplane anymore. You know, I came by train. I don't want to eat meat. But you still feel like one small individual in this big system. How do you change the system? Where you go to Davos by train, but of course you have Trump coming by helicopter, and in the next hour he's saying he will save the world with, you know, planting trees. So that's the first question. The second question is, yes, we can build partnerships. We can try to go to the new frontier, forget about institutional boundaries, just take bold action and build partnerships between government, business, NGOs, UN, because we can only do this with collective action, and this is what gives you hope, as you say, also with the public mobilization. But how do you make sure also that the money goes to the right place? I like this idea of regenerative agriculture and forest and regenerating life, but how do you make sure that today the banks and the investors put the money not in fossil fuels, but in planting trees and nature and all these solutions? So these are my two questions: system change and funding.
So just in terms of the system change one, you know, this has to be all of those things, right? I think that we have allowed ourselves to feel powerless in personal actions in relation to climate change, rather than feeling like we're part of a great shared generational endeavor, which is what we have to feel, right? And if you look at something like one example we looked at for the book was Britain during the Second World War. And even the most simple acts of like digging a victory garden to work towards, which is like everybody was encouraged to grow vegetables because the country was starving, right? And it became, rather than the sort of action of just growing potatoes, whatever else, it was, according to people who were alive then, this joyous act in a way, because it was a great shared endeavor that they were participating in towards a collective end. That's where we have to get to, right? Rather than feeling like we are isolated individuals doing our meaningless little pieces, like we are all part of a great shared generational endeavor. And I think you see that that's now building quite significantly. But it's a mental shift in ourselves as well to realize that the actions that we take are part of that, and we work to then towards building a wave. Because both have to be true. We do have to take that responsibility personally, but we also have to change the system. We can't get all the way there unless we are able to engage others and change the system. Part of that we do through our own actions, and part of it we do through political engagement. Do you want to take the finance one?
On the finance one, actually, I think the finance sector is moving faster than we thought. So you already have an asset owner alliance that was $4 trillion yesterday and will be much higher by the end of tonight, can't spill the beans, and even higher than that by the end of the week. And those are institutional financial companies, investors who own chunks of many, if not all of them together in companies, and they are exerting pressure onto those companies that they partially own for those companies to go to net zero, because that's the only way that they would keep investing. And I think you may have heard or read the letter from Larry Fink that came out from BlackRock, largest asset manager. He's not an asset owner, asset manager, $6 trillion, who said very clearly BlackRock is pulling out of thermal coal, and every single company that BlackRock is in, and BlackRock is in almost every company of the world, at least of certain size, has to disclose their climate risk. So, you know, even someone like Larry Fink, who has been long coming to this discussion, is actually already waking up. And finally, I would just like to say the divestment movement, which is the movement of the financial sector away from high carbon to clean technology, started just 4 or 5 years ago at zero. It's today at $12 trillion. So there are $12 trillion that have already either moved or are moving away from high carbon into low carbon, because they understand that this intensity of carbon means an intensity of risk. Carbon equals risk. No questions asked. And the more carbon in your portfolio, the more risky the portfolio is, the more asset value you can lose. And therefore, they are moving over to the clean technologies and the clean assets that are going to build the world that we want.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much again. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.